Karen, I would love to hear more about your life in your own words. So, where were you born and what year were you born?
I was born on June 24th, 1936, in Alliance, Nebraska. But my mother was just visiting there because we were actually living in a very small community where there was no hospital. So instead of being born in Wyoming, she was visiting relatives in Alliance, Nebraska.
And sometimes a very small detail or a smell or a sound tells it brings back a memory from your childhood. So, what memory from your childhood do you remember the most?
I remember trains because my dad worked in the depot and we lived upstairs. We had trains in the front yard and we had trains in the side yard. And they would come through at any time of day, and they were steam engines, so they were very noisy and had a very high whistle when they went through.
And that's where you grew up, above a train depot? You lived above, upstairs?
Yes, we lived upstairs, and we had no electricity or running water up there. And my brother was also born a couple of years later, and we still live there. I think we moved from there when I was in the first grade because the guy that ran the little grocery store also took three of us, I think, to a small town where there was a grade school, and I went to the first grade for a while in Guernsey, Wyoming.
What was your first? Well, what other memories do you have from your childhood, like with you and your brother, growing up in Wyoming?
Well, I guess when my mother said go out and play, we went out into the hills, and there were some old cars up there that had been hauled up there to get out of the way, I guess, and we played in those. I don't think she ever worried about snakes or anything, but we just went out to play. And I do remember that we had ice cream in the winter because we also had a river that ran by the depot, and my dad would go down and chop ice from the river, and they had a crank ice maker, and we had a small grocery store, but my parents had to go into Guernsey on the weekends and buy a block of ice for our ice box, and I guess they bought other things too that weren't available at our small grocery store. And for some reason, I do remember that the people that ran the grocery store, they must have had 3 or 4 boys, because I vaguely remember that a couple of them were on the Bataan Death March, and they died on the Death March.
What was the
And-
Death March? I don't know what the Death March is.
Well, the Japanese marched prisoners
Oh.
to Bataan, and a lot of them died on the way
Oh.
because of the heat and no food, no
Oh.
water, and I just remember the Second World War was going on at that time.
How old were you?
I probably was 6 years old. But I do remember during the war that we had ration stamps, and I think gasoline, of course, was rationed, and rubber tires for the cars, and shoes. I can remember that shoes, I think, were rationed. Sugar was rationed. There were a lot of things that weren't available during the war.
What about winters? What were the winters like growing up?
Oh my gosh, the winters were very cold because up in the depot upstairs where we lived, there was no insulation. And my dad many times stayed up all night to keep our coal burning stove going, just to keep us warm. And you would get into bed and curl up in a little circle and not want to move all night because
Yeah.
that was the only warm place. But the winters were very cold in Wyoming.
Did you guys play outside? Did you ice skate?
Well, we moved to another small town, Kirby, and there I went to the one-room schoolhouse. I finished the first grade and went 8 years. And in the 8th grade, I took a school bus into a bigger town to go to a high school. But we ice skated all winter long at night, and we built fires out of old tires. And we put potatoes in the fire, and when they were done, we skated around and ate the potatoes out of the fire. That was our big entertainment. And during the summer, there were quite a few kids out there in Kirby because we went to the one-room schoolhouse. There were 2 people in my grade for all those years. And we played hide and go seek and games like that during the summer. But we didn't. Oh, and we finally got a bicycle, and my brother and I had to take turns riding on this bike. We only got one bicycle, and there was a little tiny patch of sidewalk in this little tiny town, and we would take turns riding our bicycle on this little tiny patch of sidewalk.
So, what was your first job, or what was your first adventure that you want your friends or family to really remember?
Well, when we left Kirby, we went to a town that was much bigger and actually lived in a house because in Kirby we still lived upstairs in the depot, but we had electricity, and the trains were still in the front yard and the side yard, and we still had the river that ran by the depot also. And I forgot.
What was your first job?
Oh, in this little town, I went to work at a drugstore, and I worked after school and on the weekends. And for my drugstore gave top wages, 50 cents an hour. But I had some spending money because money was always very tight in our family. And when we first moved there, I think my brother and I walked to the movies every Saturday, and they had Roy Rogers and Gene Autry movies, and so that was our big excitement, was to go to the movies and pick out a candy bar to eat during the movies.
What was your, how did you meet your husband?
Well, in this town that I was just talking about, he went to a high school there. He was a year ahead of me, although we were the same age, but his father was a geologist and worked for the oil company that hired a few people in this small town. But most of the people there worked in the coal mines, and the kids that I went to school with in Kirby, most of their parents were from Europe, Yugoslavia, and that part of Europe, and didn't speak a lot of English. So, but Loy's father worked for a Mobil oil company, and there was some drilling going on in that area. And he went off to college, and I was still a senior, so I stayed in Basin and worked in the drugstore and saved up a little bit of money. So I went to junior college when I graduated in a town that was about 100 miles away. It was like going to the city, because that's where I saw my first television set, and I had to learn to use a dial telephone, and it was like moving to the city, although it was only a larger, small town.
Well, after you guys got married, what kind of adventures did you have?
Well, we got married. I was working, flying for Braniff. I took my training in Dallas from the small town that I went to junior college. I went to work for Braniff Airlines in Dallas, and I met him. I went home for Christmas at one time, and he was home from college, and we touched base and kept in touch, and he graduated with a petroleum engineer degree, and he worked in a small town near Kansas City where I was based at that time with Braniff. And he used to come over to Kansas City to see me, and ultimately we got married in St. Elmo, Illinois, where he was working for, I guess, Mobil Oil Company at that time. And we were transferred to Durango, or he was transferred to Durango, Colorado, after we got married. And I had to quit Braniff because you could not be married and be a hostess. So
Really?
that worked out fine because he was transferred to Durango, Colorado anyway. And we had two kids there, Kelly and Lloyd. We were there for, I think, about 4 years. And then one day he said he was complaining because he was off to work. In the meantime, we had been transferred to Ardmore, Oklahoma, which was a big change from Colorado to Oklahoma. And he said some people are coming through from Libya, which is in North Africa, and they are trying to recruit people to go to Libya to work in the oil fields there for what was to become Exxon. And, or I guess overseas it was Esso. And he said it's very disrupting to have them come in and give their spiel. And then he came home and said, well, the guys from Libya want to come by and show you some slides from Libya. He said, I don't know why they picked me to have them come into my home to show these slides. But anyway, I said, sure, I would like to see them. So they came and I looked at the slides. And then the next day they offered Loy a job to go to Libya. And the money was great.
What was it like living there in Libya?
Oh gosh, that's another story. Loy left to go to Libya, and I stayed in Ardmore because we had a small house that had to be sold, and he needed to get over there and get set up business-wise, and so I stayed on in Ardmore for a while, and then ultimately Kelly and Loy and I flew to Libya, and they were 6 and 4 years old. It was a big decision to leave the States, but the money was good, and it was just a good move for Lloyd to go at that time. So we arrived in Benghazi, and we lived in a transient villa, which was kind of a shack. And it was very, very, very different. We did not live in a compound. We lived in Benghazi among a lot of other expatriates who were young, about the same age we were. And the grocery shopping, the stores were about the size of a walk-in garage, and you picked out canned foods. That's about all they had that were imported from England. And you were given a book, and they wrote down how much you owed them, and you looked up your page and put how much you owed them. And that was their bookkeeping. And when I went to get meat, there was an area that was very large, and it was round, and it was on the edges were big chopping blocks, and the Arab men each had a chopping block, and you would say you wanted a kilo of meat, and they only had beef. I think it was imported from probably England, but I think actually it came from Holland, Amsterdam. But anyway, they would chew the cats off of the chopping block and hack off an arm, a leg of a cadaver that was hanging there, and they would chop it up into small pieces, wrap it in some cardboard, and hand it to you. And that was the meat that we got. And we went and bought fresh vegetables at the souk, which was a big shopping area. And the Arab men did all the shopping. The women did not go out into public. You only saw Arab men, although there were maids that worked in our houses, and they could go out in public to work, but that was it. So that was our food, and the shopping was not that great. We lived there for 2 or 3 years, and I had a washing machine, a Ringer type washing machine, and I had a maid who came every day, and she would wash the clothes in the washing machine, and then run them through the wringer into the bathtub, which was full of water, and she would swish them around and then run them back through the wringer into a basket and hang them outside. And that was our laundry. I don't know. I've looked back and I don't know how Lloyd's shirts ever, because he wore a white shirt and a suit to work every every day. There must have been a laundry there. I don't know. I don't remember. I guess maybe the maid ironed his shirts. I don't know. Anyway, we survived the laundry problem, and Kelly started to school there. They had a very good school because there were a lot of young teachers that wanted to travel in Europe, and they were teachers that went overseas to places like that, and they were well paid, and so she got a good start. In the first grade, I finally found a kindergarten for Lloyd, but it was British, because the British were still big in Libya from the Second World War, and the Italians, of course, Mussolini, he annexed or took Libya by force well before the Second World War, and so there were a lot of Italians there. The British were just military people that were there, but the Italians had families there, and they kind of ran everything. Like they kept the cars running, and they had beauty shops and restaurants. I don't know where they got their food, but we used to go to a restaurant and eat outside under a tree. But if you left the table, then the cats would come out of the trees and start walking around and eating your food. So you didn't want to leave the table until you had eaten everything on your plate.
And when did you leave Libya?
Oh, well, we left Benghazi and went to Tripoli. We were there, and Tripoli was a lot different than Benghazi. Benghazi was a lower class Libyans, and Tripoli was much different. The women wore barricans in Benghazi that were kind of blankets, plaid blankets or whatever they could find. But in Tripoli, the women wore white barricans, and it was the upper class. And I think most of the men in Tripoli, the Arab men, some of them were sent to the States to go to college, and came back with some kind of degree in petroleum engineering. And so Tripoli was a lot different, but we still did not live in a compound. We lived in houses that we rented from Libyans, and they were very basic. They were always two families would live side by side in kind of a duplex, and we had walls around our duplex, but we had electricity and running water, but no telephones. If you wanted to get in touch with someone, you had to go to their villa. No, when you hear that word, it was not describing what our housing was like. But we lived there quite a while. we lived in Libya 8 years, and I think probably 2 of them were in Benghazi, and the other 6 years were in Tripoli. And we were there when Gaddafi had his coup, and that was quite an experience. We couldn't leave our houses for, I think, a week or so, and we would go out into the backyard and see what our neighbors had for groceries, and we would trade around until we always had enough to eat, but we couldn't leave our houses. And then we were able to leave the houses. The only communication we had with the outside world was the BBC, and the men, of course, didn't go to work, but the company would send out little bulletins and say, tomorrow you can leave your house between 2 o'clock in the afternoon and shop for maybe 1 hour or 2 hours, and then the curfew would end, and we lived by the curfew for a couple of months, I guess. We finally got so we could be gone most of the day, but Gaddafi, everybody was gone. The embassy was gone. Wheelus Air Force Base was gone. We were just there. I suppose if things got really dangerous or whatever, Exxon or the oil companies would have gotten us out of there, but we never left. We kind of just persevered and did with what we could find on our curfews. But we were all very sure to be home when the curfew was up, because we didn't want to get arrested.
Well, after you left Libya, where did you come back to the States? Did you go someplace else?
Yes, Loy was transferred back to New York, and we lived in Connecticut because we didn't want to live in Manhattan, because by then our kids were in junior high. And so we lived in Connecticut, and he took the train every day into Manhattan to the Exxon building there. And we were there for 3 or 4 years. And then our daughter got married, and Loy was transferred back to Libya. So we put our son in boarding school in Massachusetts, because there was, of course, no high school in Libya. But the Libyan government would not give him a work permit because he had worked in Libya before Gaddafi. And so we didn't go to Libya. They sent Loy to Caracas, Venezuela instead. So we left Loy in boarding school, and Kelly was married then, and the two of us went to Venezuela, which was not a pleasant place to be. Caracas was a beautiful city, but not very well run. If you got an apartment and didn't have a telephone, you could wait up for a couple of years to get a telephone. But then we talked to people that had a telephone and it never worked anyway. And we lived on the side of a mountain, and they built all these apartments on the mountains, but they never really figured out how to get any water up to us. So we had a water truck that came, and we had roof tanks, but there were 12 apartments where we lived, and the water truck, we could see it coming up the mountain, but by the time it got to the 12th apartment, the people that ran the buildings, they would take bribes, money for the water along the way, and there was never any water left by the time it got to our apartment. So Loy would take a shower at some friend's apartment that lived down below us. We never had any water up there, and no telephone, and if you went, well, I won't go into life in, but life in Libya was a bit more structured than it was in Venezuela.
Well, of all of these life adventures that you've had, what was the funniest moment that you can remember?
The most interesting was when I went to a Libyan wedding, and a friend of mine had a maid. We all had household help. I had a houseboy who was an older man, and she had this woman who was her maid, and somebody was getting married, and my friend asked me if I wanted to go to this wedding with her. And so I said yes. So I met her at her house. The maid came in a car that was driven by, I guess they rented it or whatever, because when we got to the wedding, the men and the women were never socialized together. The women, of course, didn't leave the house unless it was to work, and the men did all the shopping and everything, so you never saw women on the street. But anyway, we went to this house where the wedding was supposed to be.